Hey everyone, welcome to our SACAC webinar today. I'm going to let a few more attendees trickle in before we officially kick off the webinar and turn it over to our grant team. But I wanted to go ahead and do just a quick introduction. My name is Shelby Keel and I serve on the SACAC webinars team as one of our co-chairs. And I'm also joined by co-chair Christina Lopez. She's in the background, so you don't see her right now. But she's going to be doing the behind the scenes work for this webinar. So if you have any technical questions during the presentation, just know Christina will be monitoring the chat box and should be able to assist you with anything you need. We also welcome you to today's webinar session, which is titled The Basics of Grant Applications, Extending the Dream SACAC Grant, and are honored to have presenters Kierstan, Cynthia, and Noah on the webinar today with us to share their expertise on grant applications. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. This is a webinar format, so audience mics are muted. We encourage you to use the Q&A box if you have any questions for the presenters, as they do plan to try and cover each question throughout the actual presentation and address it on those specific slides for you. This webinar is also being recorded and will later be shared with SACAC members on your portal, so be on the lookout for that. And then, as always, thank you again for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our session presenters now. So go ahead, Kierstan, take it away.
Thanks so much. So we're excited to be here today as the grant team for Extending the Dream grants. My name is Kierstan Dufour. I work for Get to College, a program of the Woodward Huns Education Foundation in Mississippi. And I'll let my colleagues that are on the grants team introduce themselves. Cynthia?
Hello, everyone. I am Cynthia Simpson Obioha. I'm an independent educational consultant with Capstone College Consulting, LLC. It's nice to be with you all today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Noah Pittman. I work at the Honors College at the University of Arkansas.
And we do have one more committee member that wasn't able to co-present with us, but we have an additional committee member, Katrina Cole Gardner, and she works within the Gwinnett County Schools. So this is who is reviewing all of the applications that come in for the Extending the Dream team. If you are interested in an opportunity to get involved with SACAC, this team is maybe something that you're interested in the future. So we do want to acknowledge that this is not only informative for you as potentially a grantee, but also as a SACAC member, that is something that you may want to look out in the future as far as involvement goes. So we do have a poll question just to get us started today. Those that are with us, I see we have some previous grantee names that are recognized. So here's a good question to we get a lot. What is the dollar amount of an Extending the Dream grant? So you see some options that have popped up on your screen, and we'll give you a little bit of time to answer that question as those come in. So what is the dollar amount of an Extending the Dream grant? All right, give everybody about, let's say, 10 more seconds to answer that, and then we'll get those results. All right, if we will close the poll, if you'll share those results out. So I see that we've got a large number of $2,000, some at $500, some at $1,500, and some at not applicable. The answer is not applicable. The reason being is that it depends on your grant. There's not a set amount that's awarded. It's based off of, as we'll go through today, what you've requested for your project. And so typically those grants are awarded between $500 to $3,700. We as a grant committee each year get the amount that the board has approved for the Extending the Dream grant, and then we try and maximize those dollars and impact as best as possible, being a steward of those SACAC funds. So the Extending the Dream grant value really just depends on your application as a grantee. So there's not a set amount there. Just know that it is a reimbursement grant. So you are required to submit your original receipt and with the Extending the Dream reimbursement form within 30 days of your event. So that's where the value, the dollar amount varies, but depending on what your need is. And we'll kind of talk about what we look for there. So I'm going to hand it over and kind of allow for us to dig into what exactly are the grants.
Well, that's a good place to start. And hello again, everyone. When we look at what exactly are the Extending the Dream grants, they are simply funds that enable members of SACAC to actually establish and pay for special projects within their own communities. This is an annual award. We do it every year, and the focus is to serve college-bound students. Now, many of the recipients of this grant have really served as advocates for creating pathways to college by actually pushing the limits on college access, as well as increasing awareness about the college admissions process. But the ultimate goal of an Extending the Dream grant is simply to make the dream of attending college a reality for students. Now, here before you, you see the grant application timeline. So let's go through that item by item. March 16th is the grant application deadline. And from March the 28th through the 31st, grant application interviews will be held. And then on April the 1st, big day, grant award notifications will go out to all applicants. And then from the months of April throughout December, recipients of the grant will be able to use their grant funds and, as Kierstan mentioned earlier, submit reimbursement paperwork within 30 days of your event. So exactly what are the components of the grant application? Let's dive into that and look a little bit deeper at the components that make up the application. The application for the Extending the Dream grant actually has three parts. The first part is simply contact and organization information. Part 2, you will provide your project details. And part 3, of course, you will provide your project budget. So with part 1, the contact and organization information, we're going to ask you for the things that you see on the screen there. We will want to know the grant lead's name, the organization or employer, of course, simple information like mailing address, phone number, email address. And I'll have to say, you know, if you're like me, you put your mailing address down so often, your phone number or email. Sometimes I get it wrong and I'm looking for things because I'm doing it so fast, it seems so rote. But please, ma'am, and please, sir, check that, because if you're like me, you can type it wrong and expect to get something and never get it back because I did it so fast that I just messed it up. So be careful and check and recheck, as we know you will, your mailing address, phone number, email address. And then we want to know your relationship to SACAC, your membership status. And I will say here that SACAC now has free membership for all public high school counselors as well as other employees. So this is a great time to, as Kierstan said, get involved with the organization, and then perhaps join organizations and member committees such as ours in order to stay active. And then we'll want to know the organization type, and we'll ask you questions about whether you've been a past grant recipient and some details about that. So that takes care of part 1 of the organization. And now I will hand off to Noah, and he will take us through the other parts.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. So I'm going to break down each of the components of part 2, the project details. Now, the first 2 things that we ask for in project details is first, project name. Some people get very creative with their project name. Some others just have a very simple insert high school, college visit. I don't get too hung up about having something very creative here for your project name. But also, we ask you right at the beginning to provide a detailed description of the projects. We do want to give you an example of a past detailed description that we thought worked really well. So this example right here comes from the Caminos program at North Carolina State University. For this specific program, a few years ago, we funded about $1,030 to be used toward both a travel to a ropes course and for one of their lunches that day during the program. And here's why it's a great example. It's only 3 sentences, but the first sentence, what you see is it gives us a good overview of what the program is. Even if we funded before, our committee members change, our memories change, a good, really quick overview. They start out with that, what Caminos is. It's a 4-day camp for Latinx rising high school juniors and seniors. The second sentence, it goes into what students will experience. They're going to explore career opportunities, discuss admissions process, tour different institutional types, experience the vibrancy of the city of Raleigh. So what are they actually getting from the experience? And then the third sentence goes into what are the outcomes they want. The overarching goal is lead Caminos better understand their path and vision to achieving higher education, and also being able to interact and to create a new network of scholars, staff, faculty, and campus departments. So again, only 3 sentences, but when you break it down, that summary, what students are going to experience and the outcomes, that gives us a good overview of what to expect from your specific project. Now, the next components of section 2, you start getting to approximately how many students will be served and why the population you plan to serve are most deserving. Now, we know that it's hard to plan out, especially if you're doing a fall event. You may not have an exact number there. Try to give us a best estimate that helps us, especially when we get into the budget, looking at how many are being served, price per participant, those types of things. So give us your best estimate. But we also want to give you an example of the population you plan to serve are most deserving. What's a good description you can put here? Now, this specific example comes to us from a program we did a few years ago from Latinx Ed. So this is one of their applications where we funded about $300 for lunches, some security needs, refreshments. And what you see here that stands out, especially at the beginning, is it provides really good data about the population. So as you see in here, students are first or second generation immigrants, be first in their families to attend college. So it gives us, the overall population. And within that population, a lot of them are going to be first graduate from high school. About 20% are undocumented. All are from families with limited financial resources. It's one thing to say families with limited financial resources, but you see they also put majority of Pell eligible if you're at a public high school, free reduced lunch rates, things like that. Majority of the students are from 2 rural counties, Lee and Chatham. So that's sometimes people put they're from these specific counties, but our membership, our committee doesn't cover all the states in SACAC. So we're not going to know about Lee and Chatham County more often than not. So knowing that they're 2 rural counties, where they're coming from, it gives us good description. And this one also has good description at the end because it goes into for that they're not just working with students, but they're also going to be working with parents. So that gives good description of what they're going to do with parents. They're going to be doing workshops, bilingual case studies, help them increase parental knowledge. So if you're going to be including parents in some part of the process, it's good to kind of give us a description of the parents and what services you're going to provide for them. So again, I would, especially the data makes a really big difference in this section to help us learn about your students. Always assume we don't know that much about your school or your region. And then moving on in the project details, the last thing that we're going to be looking at, though it's not coming on the screen for some reason, we're going to be looking at your expected project dates along with details on how the project will be assessed exactly. Waiting to see that here. So probably there we go. So the expected project date, give us a timeline, especially that helps, our chair, Kierstan, understand when to expect receipts. Cynthia mentioned we have that 30-day receipts need to be submitted after the event. But details on how the project will be assessed. I think this is a question I've talked about extending the dream with other people before, and they always ask, what's a good way to provide an assessment model for this? So we'll give you a good example here from a few years ago. So this example comes from Lanier High School in Sugar Hill, Georgia. Their first generation club college field trips they did a few years ago. This project, we funded about $1,400 toward bus and food for the campus visits. For these first generation students. This is probably the assessment model we see the most often. If you're just really struggling to come up with how can I assess this, the most common thing we see, and we think it can work, is you doing a pre and a post test. So this one, they go into pre and post test that will measure their knowledge before and after a college visit. So what they know before the college visit, do the post test. What do they know after the college visit, especially relates to campus life, course offering, scholarships? What information are you wanting to get from these campus visits? And this helps us, it helps us hold you accountable that you're meeting the outcomes that you want. But also, we have people who apply for grants multiple times over the course of a few years. And we know that you're assessing it, you're looking for ways to improve, you're looking, if it just didn't work, you're looking toward other types of projects. That's why we ask the assessment question. We just feel, especially since it's a grant, really any grant in the world, but this specific grant, we feel that assessments is important. So that really concludes our section on project program details. I'm going to turn back over to Kierstan so she can go into the project budget. How does that work for the grant application?
All right, so the third part of the application is the project budget. So each applicant is required to upload a budget, and this is a big piece for the Extending the Dream, but also I've had the opportunity to sit on several different mini grant committees with different organizations, and this is really the piece that is a large growth area for knowledge, I think. And for the Extending the Dream, the budget is, we look at the description, we look at the population served, the number of students that will be impacted, but then the money, right? What are you asking for and how are you articulating that? So the next thing, this is what you see when you complete the application, is this example of a budget is embedded within the form. You will upload your own budget. And so this is provided from the grant committee. And, we spent a lot of time reviewing these. So we wanted to dig in a little bit to what parts of the budget to make you aware of that we really are looking at and highlighting. So things to consider when you're developing your budget is keeping it organized and clear on how much for each line item. So really the better line items that you can break out and what those anticipated costs are if you've already acquired some sort of additional funding is also very important there. So that way we know they're doing a campus visit or a tour of campus visits. They already have housing as a part of their budget, and that's taken care of from an donation or another funding source, but what are they asking for us? And so knowing what is most important in your line items of your budget is something that we will always ask in your interview, is what if the things that you've listed is most important that you really need funding? Because we do have limited funds and we want to make sure our dollars are making the most impact where they're needed. Of course, we would love to fund everything possible to help all of the students in all of the types of ways, but we can't. And so how we look at the budget is making sure that we know really, what are your top 1, 2, 3 priorities if you're asking for a lot of line items to be covered. And we try and meet those needs as best as possible. So in this example that you see that's provided for you, you see what those items are, and it's the projected cost, the amount of the secured funds for the item if you already have that, and then the amount requested. So keeping those in 3 columns helps us know exactly what ETD is being asked for. All right.
Kierstan, before you go to the next slide, we do have a question in the chat. Are the ETD grants only for 501c3s?
So there is no definition of who can get them. We traditionally do lean towards supporting institutions that are nonprofit in the basis, but we look forward to seeing, we take each individual one and look and see what is happening there, what's the activity. I know that we funded in the past, there was like an independent counselor that was doing some community organizing. Sorry, that word was trouble for me. In terms of doing awareness around college, and it was free to the public, and they were looking for funding for supplemental materials. And so those printing and binders and things like that. while that individual owned a company, they were doing something that was in the mission, like Cynthia mentioned earlier, is that access to the college knowledge piece. So to answer your question, it doesn't have to be, but we do tend to fund those that have oftentimes nonprofits or 501c3s or schools or institutions are doing a program that falls within that, but that doesn't mean it's the only thing. We really want to look at what impact is being made and what that population with high need is getting as a result of the project. I hope that answered your question. Thanks, Noah, for bringing that up. All right, so this next budget that you see on the screen is an actual budget that was submitted a few years ago. We funded $2,655 of this budget with grant funds. And so this was for an Atlanta Public Schools project that was working to create programming for 6 different high schools across the district. And it reached about 4,500 students. That it created a comprehensive support program for college entry and persistence. So like I just mentioned, kind of aligning that knowledge access place. And it was a large number of students that were being reached. So we knew that the value of those dollars of the grants were going a long way for students in the Atlanta Public Schools. So here's how this budget was funded. You can see they have their projected, their secured, their amount needed. When we reviewed the amount needed, that's what we were looking at to see, okay, there was, a request for the grant committee of $33,350, but we knew where that breakdown was. And so when we interviewed this grant applicant, possible grantee, we asked them about their project because we had reviewed that beforehand and had questions about that specifically, but dug more so into the budget place here. And so we asked about, have you considered getting a donation of this? If you don't have in your budget, if you're working on building it out and submitting it by next Wednesday, and you haven't thought about the project secured already line, we would love to help you think through that. And so hopefully this webinar is doing so to see, is there a way that you can minimize those costs to maximize the spread of the dollars here. And so oftentimes our committee will sit and we'll talk about, hey, let's make sure we bring a suggestion where they look into this item that will be, see if they can get a donation, or reach out to this organization that maybe can support them, or how can they, think through their budget a little bit better. And so you may get an email from us on April the 1st that has not only that you've received a grant, but also suggestions around, hey, we want to give you, because we do see a lot of applications and we do have a lot of exposure, and we may be seeing what one group is doing to maximize those dollars that another group maybe hasn't thought about, type of thing. So how we budgeted and how we awarded this budget, how we awarded this grant according to this budget was we did $750 for the College Success Boot Camp. So we were able to take care of that line item. $800 for the College Melt program supplies. So we took care of that item. $200 for scholarship seminar, $800 for post-secondary advising, and $105 for college readiness and curriculum groups. And so that's where we got to our number. And as a team, what we do is we look at each of those items and say, okay, where are the highest need ones, but also what did they tell us in the interview was the largest impact, or what they prioritize. So we tried to meet that. Sometimes you may get a grant that's like, wow, $2,655 is a really random number to be awarded. But you can see with that breakdown of that one being 105, it may have been, we were formulating some numbers with our all of our grants, and we were trying to give to as much as possible. So maybe that was not covering all of it, but it's at least some towards it, type of thing. Cynthia, no, anything you want to add here around budget? I know this is kind of where we all spend a good bit of our time in discussion as a committee.
The only thing that I would add, Kierstan, is as our potential grant applicants are thinking about budget, it is important to think about which items you deem most important, because you could very well get a question from the committee which of these items do you think is most necessary that we can help you with? So it is helpful, I think, to go ahead and think about that up front, because that could be a very real question that we ask as we try to clarify things moving forward.
Yes, I definitely agree with Cynthia. That's probably the question we ask most often in interviews, especially I'd say if it's over $1,000 and there's multiple line items. That doesn't mean we won't fund the rest, but that does give us an idea of what's the most important to you.
Well, there are a few other things that we ask for in the budget section. So you upload your budget with those detailed items as best as possible. And then we ask if you'll receive any outside funding and additional resources and provide those details. So if you already know that you've gotten another grant or your district does internal grants or things like that, that will be covering that secured funds line is where you would include that, but you may be in the application process for an additional grant or working on getting some donations from businesses or things like that to cover some things. So we want to know if you're only relying on the funds of the Extending the Dream grant, or you have other irons in the fire and funding sources, if you will. And then when will you need to receive the ETD grant funds for this project? That's one thing that we definitely wanted to make sure and look at, because it is a reimbursement grant. And so we want to make sure you're thinking through what that looks like in terms of your project planning. So we have an example kind of to bring all of those pieces together of a successful application and grant recipient. So they became a grantee. And we wanted to share this with you and kind of provide you feedback from what a successful application through interview, through grant, through reimbursement kind of looks like for a project. If you join our webinar and you're like, I want to do this, I want to support my student population, I'm just not quite sure what exactly that could look like. So I want to give you a real life example. This is from Aaron Chadwick, a 2021 ETD grant recipient at Calvary Day School. So in the 2021 grant cycle, their project was the Cavalier Exploring Colleges, and they received a $2,000 grant to support campus tours for 28 juniors. So when we gave you an example of the Atlanta Public Schools, that was 4,500. This is an example of, we do fund, a one that reaches 28 students type of thing. It just kind of depends on what the application and the project looks like and impact. So let me share with you in Aaron's words the impact of this project. So the generous grant that my school received from SACAC allowed us to take 29 juniors on a college trip to 5 colleges. Well, the number of participants was lowered due to COVID, as we've all probably experienced before the past 2 years. The winter weather cut our trip short by 1 college. We were committed to providing this opportunity to our students. Below are some points that she wanted to highlight and as noteworthy, and were solely made possible because of the Extending the Dream grant. So 1 senior student planned the route of the trip and the travel details, which was a great opportunity for that student to kind of be a part of the process. So it wasn't just Erin doing it all. It was that she involved her students as well. So thinking about that as you develop your project narrative. 26 of the students had never, ever in their life been on a college campus before. 18 of the students had never stayed overnight in another state. 6 were first generation students. 29 students participated in Stuff the Stadium at a college basketball game that they attended, which allowed them the experience of student life as well as philanthropy on a college campus, which we know is a big part of that student experience while they're there. 29 of the students have added at least one of the colleges to their apply list for next year. And 26 students got lost on their self-guided tour during their campus tour and learned the value of reading a map and the value of asking questions did not want to come home. So they all enjoyed that experience. And this is a great reflective piece as you think about what your project narrative is, and then how you hope to share that success, hopefully with us as the grant committee, but then also within your network to know and build out sustainable funding. So that way you can share with your district or share within your community or share with another funding organization the impact that $2,000 can have in students' lives. 29 students there were touched, 28 juniors and 1 senior, and it was able to really build a life experience for so many students that maybe prior didn't have that. So I wanted to take a few moments and kind of share what that narrative provided, what that looks like, and then thank all of you for the time it takes to fill out the application, to go through the interview process, to do the project and support the students as well. I know we have some questions coming in, so I'm going to take a moment and review those. Cynthia, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't have anything to add to that, Kierstan. I think that was a wonderful example of how this particular grant can affect and create some positive change and lean in toward college access and college awareness. I think that was a great example. I do think I saw a question about whether the recording of this would be available later. I think I saw that in the chat, and I think
Yes.
it will be, correct?
Yes, it will be on the YouTube channel, and then we're also going to link it to the Extending the Dream grant page on the SACAC website. I see the question that's come through the Q&A around primarily determining the amount of individuals served. How are we defining impact? And so kind of how I mentioned earlier, it just depends on the dollar amount as well as the number of students that you're planning for that project to be impacted and your student population. That is a big thing too, is that, we want that access as much as possible to those populations that, like the application says, most deserving. And then, understanding that that may be that you're doing a workshop for like this 28 students, but all are first generation non-native English speakers. And so that is a large impact of knowledge that will be shared there. So I don't have an exact number. Like you said, I can't be precise. We've had, like I shared, 4,500. We've had 6. There was one that we did a few years ago, and Noah, Cynthia, if you remember, it was specifically for African American males. It was a smaller cohort. I think it was like maybe 6 to 10, but it was like kind of in a cohort form where they worked through the school semester, and that population, that application did a very good job of explaining why that population really needed that extra support. And so while we had some concerns around, okay, this is not as impactful in terms of the spread of the money to more people, it is impactful within a specific community. And so we were able to fund, again, we don't often get to fund all of it, but we can at least help that portion of it, so we know that budget line item. Are there any other examples or things that you all want to share around that?
Well, I'm sorry, Noah, were you getting ready to go ahead with something?
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay. The only thing that I was going to add was that when we talk about the word impact, sometimes that word can take you to thinking about maybe a number, and impact is not necessarily, it's not necessarily numbers driven. Think about the actual intent of the award, which is to create college access. If you're doing something that's going to create a college going culture, creating awareness around the college admissions or search process for groups of students that don't necessarily have that. The biggest thing is how you share that information with us, because you take the approach that we don't know anything about you, your town, as Noah was talking about earlier. your locales. So tell us everything, give us details, make it vivid so that we can get an idea of what and why what you're asking for creates impact for the students that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, and I agree with Cynthia right there. Everything she said, there's a quantitative side to this and there's a qualitative side when we read these applications, do the interviews. So I would automatically say, oh gosh, I'm only gonna be serving 15 students, I shouldn't even apply. You know, we as Kierstan said over and over again, we have had a wide range of projects that in terms of the numbers of students that are being impacted.
I see another question that's come through. Do you have a list of other entities that also fund the goal of increasing college access? I know as the Extending the Dream Grant Committee, I don't think we do, but I know that there is a knowledge space around college access. I work for College Access nonprofit, so I live in this space. But Noah, Cynthia, let me see if you all want to speak to that. That's a great suggestion that we could always work with SACAC in kind of highlighting what other opportunities are there.
Well, I agree with you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't have anything to add. Maybe that's something as us as a committee, as we're reviewing applications, we can also be keep an eye on when there's other funding sources already secured, looking into those and seeing, is that something more of our applicants can apply for, not just the one application we're reading.
Agreed.
Yeah, and so we love that feedback, and I will work with our committee to highlight that. You know, the National College Attainment Network is like the professional organization at the national level around college access, and they oftentimes will be the source for large funders like a Kresge or a Strata or Illumina. Larger foundations will filter great opportunities through there, and so they oftentimes are a good place to kind of look at. They are another member organization. But that is a great suggestion that we will work around. And there may be a more local organization that's regional based or state based or city based that you may want to work like your community foundation to see if they have any type of, you know, if their mission is driven around access to college or education type of thing. All right, so I see another question come through. If we've been recipients of the grant in the past recent years, are we eligible to apply again this year for a similar project and event? Yes, just because you've been, I will disclose, because you've been in the past doesn't necessarily guarantee you will in the future, but we absolutely want to have your application in there as a part of the mix to be reviewed. We've had organizations that have brought different projects from year to year or the same project year to year. And so there may be a different funding amount. There may not be funding because every, you know, group a round of applications each year looks different, and we take each year and compare it to each other. We do ask in the application if you've received a Extending the Dream grant before and what that project was, just so we can go back into historical and see, well, what did we fund in the past? What does that look like? We do look in that. It's not a pro or a con in either way. It's just for our kind of institutional knowledge, because we do turn over every 3 years within that. And so knowing around that. Is there anything y'all want to add to repeat applicants? All right, so hopefully that answered your question there. These are great questions, and we appreciate you all taking the time and having dialogue with us today. We hope that this is a skill set. We kind of created this webinar as like, yes, we have this grant that's available through next week, but also this is hopefully great skill sets that you can use in other, you know, funding options. So that way you can get additional funds and understand from those that are, you know, kind of behind the scenes reviewing your applications, what we're looking at, and use that in other avenues as well. So we appreciate all that you do for your students, your membership within SACAC, or your involvement in the space of that college, whatever that looks like for you and your role and your students. So we appreciate all that you do. We'll leave the option for questions to come in for a few more minutes, but Noah, Cynthia, is there any other parting words of wisdom that we wanted to share?
Well, I'll say two things. Again, the deadline is March 16th for grant applications. And I believe that deadline is 5 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Central Time, March 16th, 5 p.m. Central Time is the deadline for the application. And we enjoy and look forward to reading your applications. And thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much. We look forward to them, and we look forward to the ones we select as finalists for the interviews as well.
Oh, that's one great point too, is that we will communicate predominantly through email. So like Cynthia said, make sure that your email is correct, because you'll get notifications around if you're selected for the next round for an interview. And then you utilize Calendly for that interview, which is all through email. And then your award notification will be through email. So that is our predominant mode of communication. So make sure that you're checking that. And that will be how we share the information in the process with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much again. We're going to close out this webinar now, but if you guys do have any questions, feel free to continue to pop them in the chat or the Q&A. And also feel free to reach out to us on the webinar team or Kierstan and her team as well if you do have further questions, and we'll of course make sure that you get those answers as needed. But thank you again for joining the webinar today. We also want to thank Revolution Prep for sponsoring today's session, and just wanted to give a special shout out to Kierstan, Cynthia, and Noah for leading today's session and taking time out of their day, probably their lunchtime right now, to chat with you all more about grants. So we hope you all were able to learn more about what goes into the grants application from today's webinar. And just a reminder, be on the lookout for SACAC announcements about upcoming webinars that are going to be coming soon. We do have another additional webinar this month. It's going to be next week on Thursday, March 17th at noon Eastern Time, so 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And it is titled Getting the Most Out of SACAC and Conference. So this is going to be hosted in preparation for SACAC Conference, which is coming up in April, which is literally right around the corner. I can't believe we're already almost in April and it's 2022. But with that said, we will let you all go and enjoy the rest of your guys' day. Definitely eat some lunch if it's your lunch break. And we hope you all have a wonderful Wednesday and rest of your week. Bye, y'all.